I feel very tall on this thing. Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people here, and it's always nice to come to Scarborough. Never need an excuse. So what I want to talk about today, last Monday, we were just backfilling our trenches after the completion of our 10th season of excavation on the early medieval monastic site at Lindisfarne. And what I want to do this evening is talk a bit about the broad sense of what we've been uncovering, what we've started to unpick. We started to better understand the early medieval monastery, and also bring you some information about some broader kind of changes in the way we're thinking about the story of Lindisfarne and the relics of Cuthbert, because not just through our archaeological work, but archaeological work being done elsewhere by colleagues in Durham, and also work being done on historical sources, we're really starting to provide a new story on how we understand, particularly the latter half of the first millennium, and how Cuthbert is linked to Lindisfarne and, of course, to Durham itself. So I'm going to try and avoid inflicting too many calendar dates on you, but it's really useful, I think, to provide you with a kind of basic overview of the chronology of the site, and also introduce you to some of these dates which we're starting to critique and change. Now, I'm going to work on a principle that if you haven't been to Lindisfarne, you at least know where it is. We're right up in the north of Northumberland, just off the A1. Obviously, the A1 wasn't there at the time. We're about 10 miles south of the River Tweed, in an area which, of course, today is the Anglo-Scottish border. But in the period I'm talking about, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, that Anglo-Scottish border wasn't there because there was no England and there was no Scotland. Instead, Northumbria, as a kingdom, extended up to the Firth of Forth, so all of southern Scotland was in Northumbria, and of course down to the Humber itself. So the early medieval kingdom of Northumbria formed a great big kingdom slap bang in the middle of Britain. And I think it's really useful to think about Northumbria not as a northern English kingdom, but as a central British kingdom. Because yes, it looks down towards the world of the Anglo-Saxons to the south, but also, which is really important for the Lindisfarne story, it looks northwards to the world of the Picts, the Strathclyde British, and the Dalriadic Irish kingdoms in western Scotland. So Lindisfarne itself was founded in 635 by King Oswald and St Aidan. King Oswald has been in exile in western Scotland. His uncle, King Edwin, is king. And if you are the heir to an Anglo-Saxon throne, it's bad for your health because the current king will want to kill you. So Oswald and his family, his brother Oswy, they are in exile in the Irish-speaking kingdom of Dalriada, which is basically Argyll and some of the Inner Hebrides in western Scotland. And here, Oswald and his family convert to Christianity. And he joins what's essentially the Irish of a Northern Irish church. Edwin, his uncle, had already converted to Christianity under the influence of St Augustine and King of Kent, and this sets up some problems which we'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, Oswald comes in, he brings monks from Iona, because it's probably at Iona that Oswald has converted to Christianity. Now, a lot of you will know Iona is an island monastery, so when Oswald brings monks over from Iona to Lindisfarne, an island, it's hard to resist the idea that he's trying to establish his own Iona for Northumbria, an Iona of the east. And so for the first 30 years, Lindisfarne is essentially a daughter monastery of Iona. But we have problems in the Northumbrian court, because while some are following the Irish tradition of Christianity, the Northern Irish tradition, others are following the Roman tradition. So we have a situation where the king of Northumbria is having a feast at the end of Easter, while his wife, who follows a different tradition, is still fasting. So that's not a recipe for domestic harmony. But there are bigger issues. It's about authority, it's about conformity of practice, and I think also there's a broader socio-cultural context. It's about whether Northumbria wants to look north into the world of the Scots and the Picts and the British, who are following the Irish traditions, or whether they want to look south towards the Anglo-Saxon world. So, Synod of Whitby, not too far from here, 664, there's a great debate. The Coleman, the abbot of Lindisfarne, speaks for the Irish church, Wilfrid speaks for the Roman church, and the king, Oswy, decides that Northumbria, as a kingdom, is going to go with the Roman tradition, which leaves Lindisfarne in a difficult position because they are part of the Irish church. So Coleman goes back to Lindisfarne, taking a lot of the monks with him. He then goes back to Iona and ultimately off to Western Ireland. It's at this point Lindisfarne becomes part of the mainstream Northumbrian church. But there's a challenge for the monastery, because normally every monastery has a patron saint, a founding saint, around which the monastery looks towards for kind of ritual ideological sanction. And normally that saint will be your founder member. So initially for Lindisfarne, the patron saint was Aidan. But Aidan is associated with the wrong side of the Synod of Whitby. And this is where Cuthbert comes in. Cuthbert comes into the monastery of Lindisfarne. He comes from the Scottish borders. He is associated with the winning side of the Synod of Whitby. He has a reputation for sanctity, and he's probably also seen as a pair of safe political hands. He's someone who's able to deal with the tensions in the monastery between the various factions, and he spends time as abbot and a bishop, but he also has a drive to be a hermit, and he spends his final years as a hermit on the island of Lindisfarne, which is visible just across the water a couple of miles away from Lindisfarne. And arguably the best thing that Cuthbert ever does for Lindisfarne is he dies, because a dead saint is better than a live prior. So Cuthbert, when he dies, his body is brought back to Lindisfarne. He's buried beneath the main church, and then after 10 years, they inspect his body. It is found to be miraculously incorrupt, which is seen as a sign that he is a saint. And his body is raised up out of the ground, placed in a wooden chest above the ground. You can still see that wooden chest in Durham Cathedral. And that's the point at which he becomes a saint, because in the Anglo-Saxon church, it's not a bureaucratic process, it's really through popular acclamation. So his body is lifted out of the ground into an above-ground shrine, given various relics. Some of you will know things like the Cuthbert cross. That kicks off what we might call the cult of Cuthbert. I don't mean cult in the pejorative sense, but the devotion to Cuthbert. It's probably around this time the Lindisfarne Gospels are created as part of that promotion of Cuthbert as an important saint. And this is really, really important to remember. Lindisfarne is a royal monastery, it has royal patronage, so it has the might of the Northumbrian kingdom behind the development of devotion to Cuthbert. Pilgrims come, they bring donations of kind of bullion and resources, and particularly land. And very soon, Lindisfarne acquires very, very large land holdings. So when you're on the island, you look towards the mainland, they own everything you can see, bar Bamburgh Castle. They own blocks of land up the Tweed as far as Coldstream. They own chunks of land in the Scottish borders and Lothian. They are essentially have as much land as a small Anglo-Saxon kingdom. This makes them very politically powerful, economically powerful, and socio-culturally powerful. It's probably this wealth that attracts the Viking raids. And one of the things everyone knows about Lindisfarne is 793 is the first dated Viking attack on a site in Britain. There's one undated attack which probably happened previously. And it's probably this wealth, the fact that Lindisfarne is acting essentially as a small town in a world where there are no small towns, acting as a market centre. It's probably this which attracts the Vikings. The Scandinavians are already part of the North Sea trading economy, and really what they're doing, so the presence of the Vikings is always depicted as a surprise attack. In fact, they probably just turned up for a market and then just started fighting, rather than kind of unexpectedly raiding. They obviously knew Lindisfarne. They arrived on the Feast of St. Cuthbert, which would have been a big feast. There would have been a lot of people there. So they knew the landscape, they knew the calendar, they knew the best time to attack. Then the traditional sources say that Viking attacks increase over the 9th century. And then the documentary sources, which most people use to explore this story, the works of Simeon of Durham, are a bit confusing, but they give two different dates, the point at which Cuthbert's relics and the monastery leave Lindisfarne, go inland to a site called Norham, which is on the River Tweed. And then the traditional narrative is they then spend time moving Cuthbert's relics around the northeast or the north of England and southern Scotland before going down to Chester Street, just near Durham, where they stay for around 100 years before taking the relics of Cuthbert to Durham in AD 995, and that act is what founds the city of Durham. Now, I should say, those dates, the whole story about Cuthbert's relics being moved, the island being deserted, Cuthbert's relics being moved down to Chester Street, is now increasingly contested, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. But the crucial thing is, after all this hoo-ha, certainly by the time the Normans arrive, Cuthbert's relics are at Durham Cathedral, and then the monks come back and they build a new, smaller priory on the site of the larger early medieval monastery. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute as well. So this is the island itself. And it's useful to get some kind of sense of context. Just a matter of how many people have actually been there. So lots of you. Now, unless you swam there or rowed there, you'd have come along the main causeway from the mainland, from Beal. You go along a tarmac road. That road was put in 1952, and before that, the only way across was literally walking across the sands. We know from historical mapping that there used to be multiple routes across those sands. The main route, it was probably one which doesn't exist now, which basically ran due west from the village. So the village is, hopefully you can see my cursor? I'm not sure if you can. You can see the village in the bottom left-hand side, and literally if you just go due west from the village, there are early maps with routes across the sands, and crucially, if you follow that road due west, you end up in a village called Fenham, which we know was the estate centre for all the estates of Islandshire, which is a big block of land which was held on the mainland. And at the other end of that routeway was the tithe barn for the later medieval estates. Now, it's not just access routes which are different. A lot of the topography of the island has changed. Now, those of you familiar, you know there's a small half-moon shaped harbour. You can see that quite clearly on the southern edge of the island. But you can see behind it there's a larger low-lying area in dark green on this map. And until probably the late 18th century, the area kind of immediately north of the harbour was actually an open water lagoon. So we have clear maps showing that water's going considerably inland. So where the village is now, which is where the early medieval monastery is, that would have been on much more of a pronounced headland than it is today. Also, we've had geoarchaeological work been going on in the interior of the island, and you can see from the maps that the interior of the island has a lot of drainage ditches. There's the small pond, well, the big pond called the Lough. We can show from a geoarchaeology that the interior of the island the soil levels have risen 4 to 5 metres over the last 2,000 years or so. So as well as having the larger area of open water, the middle of the island would have been a much larger area of salt marsh, poorly drained land, which would have meant that effectively the main island was almost divided into two, with a long north-south ridge on the left, on the west, our marshy area, and then the area on the east. So which would really have accentuated the role or the position of the monastery surrounded by water. Now, interestingly, we'll come back to look at this in a second, there's not been as much work done on the archaeology of Holy Island as one might anticipate, given its importance, and B, it's a really nice place to be. So when we started our project, we were the first project, and it's a collaborative project between myself at Durham University and Dig Ventures. When we started it, we've really been the only archaeological project which has made a serious large-scale attempt to investigate the archaeology of the early medieval monastery. There's been other projects on the island, but they focused on other parts of the island, or they focused on things like the later priory. So we started our project in 2016. We'd done some geophysical survey on the island a couple of years before. And in 2016, we started quite small scale with a couple of evaluation trenches. And over the years, we've expanded and expanded and expanded. And you can see on the drone photo here from a couple of years ago, our location, most of our trenches have been in this field area to the south of the main priory. And you can see that the ruins of the later Norman priory is quite a compact little compound. And then to the top of the picture, so to the west of the priory, you can also see the parish church. And you can see immediately how the priory church and the parish church are on the same axial alignment, which is absolutely classic Anglo-Saxon church planning. So there's a kind of smoking gun that's where the most likely place to find the core of the early medieval monastery. Now I should say it's project, we have quite short seasons, 3-4 weeks. We're quite a digital project, so we no longer have paper on site. Everything we do, I mean, we started off having stuff on recording on tablets. Now we've just got an app on our phone and we can do all the recording on that. We can take digital sketch photos and things as we go. We do photogrammetry, trench level, photogrammetry, so 3D photographic modelling of individual features, trenches, plus get the drones up and do whole landscape. So my partners at Dig Ventures are particularly interested in that digital side of archaeology. Also important to say, although we finished the excavation, we've still got a lot of work to do on the post-excavation. So everything I'm going to say kind of from now on is contingent on the fact that we might change our minds completely when we do more detailed analysis, and I'm sure you know that's how archaeology really works. Now, there's some practical challenges when we're looking at the early medieval monastery. First of all, early medieval monasteries, particularly ones like Lindisfarne and Iona, are very, very big. So here you see a plan of the current medieval village, of the current village on Holy Island, and we are now fairly confident that the early medieval monastery extends from the rocky ridge, the Hoof, at the very south of the island, all the way up under the whole village and pops up the other side to the north of the village. So good, about maybe 400 metres at least, compared with the tiny little, you can see in the middle there, the tiny little later Norman priory. So it's important to emphasise we're putting some quite relatively small holes in a relatively big site. So there's a challenge, obviously, we are only looking at we're doing keyhole surgery on a big site. The other big challenge, obviously, is that the medieval village has grown up on top of a lot of the monastery. And whenever people have excavated holes in the centre of the village, they have found early medieval material, but it's right at the bottom of the much later layers of midden material from the medieval and post-medieval periods. So right in the heart of the village, there's about 2 metres of stratigraphy to go down through before you get to the early medieval. However, where most of our excavation is, to the east of the priory, that's a field which has never really been occupied. It's just been ploughed a little bit in the Middle Ages. And there, when we took the topsoil off, 12 inches, foot down, straight onto early medieval archaeology. Now, as I said, there's not been as much archaeology as one would think at Holy Island. This map shows all the stuff which has gone on in the village, which looks a lot, but it's really not that much. Some of the earliest work was done in the site of the Norman Priory. The very earliest, the late 19th century stuff, was little more than landscape gardening. It was clearance out of rubble and collapse by the lord of the manor, and it was really just preparing it so you could get more visitors coming into the site. It was then investigated in the 1920s by Charles Piers, who also excavated at Whitby, and again they were focusing on the later medieval monastery. It was very kind of hands-off archaeology, very different from how we imagine it today. Piers had a foreman, and each week the foreman would write a letter to Charles Piers, who mainly stayed down in London, and basically the letter was, here is some of the nice stuff we found this week, and some nice sketches of later medieval pots. We didn't really get down into the early medieval archaeology. The site's then visited in the 1960s by Brian Hope Taylor, who some of you may know as being really important as the excavator of Yevering, which is an Anglo-Saxon palace site about 15 miles inland, due west of Lindisfarne. Very seminal, one of the first sites to use big open area excavation in Britain, a masterclass in fieldwork. He finished excavating Yevering in September 62 and came literally next day over to Lindisfarne, where he completely lost his archaeological mojo, and just dug some fairly desultory trenches in the field to the west of the parish church, little slit trenches, some little trenches along the top of the Hoof, there's this rocky crag at the south. And then he was a man with demons. He kind of left archaeology. He only died in 2001, and his archives were literally rescued from a skip. He'd never published his Lindisfarne material. I've been able to track down his excavation reports from, or his sections and plans from Lindisfarne. I'm trying to write them up at the moment, but all we have are the drawn sections and plans. There are virtually no site notes, none of the finds survive, so we don't really know much about what he found. Then there's been more recent little holes dug as part of the archaeological planning process, but pretty small stuff. And then there was a community archaeology lottery-funded project which did stuff all over the island and did a little bit in the heart of the village. And then our projects came on stream really from 2016 was our first season. So here you've got a sense of the size of this. On the right, you can see on the right you can see the aerial photograph of Lindisfarne, and at the same scale, I've put an aerial photograph of Iona. And you can probably just about see. I'm sorry, I haven't got a pointer, but you can see how the big green bit in the middle, the village hasn't grown up on top of Iona, and because the village is not on top of a later monastery at Iona, they've been able to do a lot of geophysical survey in archaeology, and it's possible to see that Lindisfarne and Iona, the monasteries, are more or less the same size in the early Middle Ages. So there we go. That gives you a sense of where our excavation trenches are. Over the 10 years, we've excavated 10 trenches in that main field. We've always focused on the area you can see there to the east of the Priory, but we put trenches across that whole field, trying to kind of, some of them have been more extensive excavations, some have been evaluations, just to kind of sniff the archaeology and get a sense of what's going on. First of all, though, let's think about what we've actually got. Now, I started the story with 635 and the foundation of the monastery, but there's a potential pre-monastic phase out on Holy Island. Now, ignoring all the prehistoric archaeology, we do have some references to Lindisfarne in the early Middle Ages, but before the foundation of the monastery. There's a document called the Historia Bretonum, which only survives in kind of later 9th, 10th century copies, was probably compiled in the 9th century, but contains references to historical events dating quite a bit earlier. And talking about the period, really the later 6th, early 7th century, it does mention Holy Island. It doesn't call it Lindisfarne, because that's the Anglo-Saxon name. It uses the name Ynys Mydcaut, which is basically the Old British name. So Old British was a language which was spoken in North Northumbria before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, and basically it's a version of Old Welsh. And it tells the story of how 4 British kings, so these are Welsh-speaking kings from the north of England, central Britain, are fighting an Anglo-Saxon. So it talks about how Urien and Rhydderch and Gwallawg and Morcant are fighting Theodoric, the Anglo-Saxon, and they besiege him on Ynys Mydcaut. But it all goes horribly wrong. They fight amongst themselves, and it all kind of collapses. But crucially, this reference to a siege on Holy Island. And I suspect, although I can't prove, because I haven't been able to dig a hole there yet, I suspect that the Castle Rock at Lindisfarne, the castle itself is 16th century, I suspect the Castle Rock is probably the site of an Iron Age / early medieval hill fort. Certainly Bamborough, just across the water on a very similar kind of rocky crag, is also certainly an Iron Age early medieval hill fort. And more generally in this part of northern England, southern Scotland, hill forts on rocky crags are an attested part of the archaeological landscape in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries. And there's been this rather nice strap end has been found out at the castle. So there are just hints that there may have been perhaps a secular power centre on the island for the foundation of the monastery. You've also got little hints of other activity. On the right you can see that's Samian, so that's terra sigillata. It's not Samian's inaccurate terminology. Terra sigillata, shiny Roman pottery, 2nd, 3rd century AD. We found 3 fragments of this on our excavations. Important to remember, we are 40 miles north of Hadrian's Wall, so we're outside the Roman Empire for most of the Roman period, with a brief couple of decades in the 2nd century when we're south of Antonine Wall. From our various carbon-14 dates of various features, although most of our carbon-14 dates are later, are connected to the early medieval monastery, we've found at least one which is definitely, from a patch of charcoal, definitely pre-monastic, and one which is probably pre-monastic. So there's little hints of, not very clear, not very identifiable, but hints of something going on earlier before the foundation of the monastery. And that's not really a surprise, because we know that when monasteries are founded, they tend to be given very good land, and if they're being given good land, there's going to be someone there already. So normally what we see at places like Whithorn or Port Mahomac up in Scotland, that monasteries are basically secular centres given over to monastic life, rather than just completely greenfield foundations. Now, I'm going to focus in on just one of our main trenches here, and here you can see a plan. So this is north off to the left there. And this trench has changed shape multiple times over the course of excavation. This isn't quite the shape it was this season, because obviously we extend it to answer new questions. Areas we've previously excavated, we've kind of we've changed as we've gone. Now, there's a series of features going on here. It probably looks a bit of a mess at first, but bear with me. Now, the latest feature, you can see we've got this big round grey oval in the middle. And that is the latest feature we've got for all intents and purposes. And that is a Norman lime kiln. Carbon-14 dates clearly post it to the late 11th, early 12th century, and almost certainly for the production of slaked lime for the mortar for the construction of the later medieval priory, which is just off the picture there. So that is the latest feature. That cuts most of our other features. We've then got an early feature. Our early feature, there's a big ditch which underlies everything you see here. You can see I've shown kind of the north-south edges of it there, and this season we followed it and found it popping up elsewhere to the south right of our trench, and you can get a slightly better sense of it. Now, this underlies everything. Because it's got all the other archaeology on top, we haven't been able to excavate that whole trench. Instead, we focused and just put in a couple of slots. And here's one of the slots we dug 2 years ago, and it's just a vertical section through our ditch. And what we've got is a big, and it's about 2.5 metres plus deep, wide 4 metres at least, a big V-shaped ditch. We've had 2 carbon-14 dates from that, both of which are mid-7th century. So one is 638 to 684, and one is 665 to 774. Bearing in mind the monastery is founded in 635. So I'm fairly happy that what we've got here is the boundary of the first monastery. Early medieval monasteries would be surrounded by a large ditch called a vallum, which was as much a symbolic boundary as a practical boundary. It marked the sacred space. We've also subsequently picked up this ditch. We had another section through it in our main trench. We picked it up right to the south, almost as far south as the edge of the hoof as well in excavations this year. So it's clearly quite a substantial boundary feature. But crucially, it became filled in. Now we know we've done geoarchaeological work, taking soil samples from the soil, looking at the structure of the soil itself, and we can be fairly confident that this ditch didn't just silt up, it was deliberately backfilled. So we have a situation where we have our early feature, our big ditch, which is mid-7th century probably. It's deliberately backfilled. Then we're going to have a whole series of things we're going to look at in a second on top of it. And then right at the top is our lime kiln. So all the other features we're going to look at now are sandwiched between our 7th century ditch and our 11th century lime kiln. So that's great. So we know that they must all relate to the early medieval monastery. And sorry, there's just a slightly clearer picture. And you can see you've got these tip lines. As I said, we've now found this in multiple places across our large field. So what's sitting on top of it? Well, you can see hopefully here, we've got a series of stone buildings, stone structures, walls. We found more of them as we've gone. This is a year-old picture. I haven't got the latest pictures from site because we've only just got off-site. And what you can kind of see, actually, if I go to the plan, you can see that actually our stone structures, they're actually more or less sitting right on top of our ditch. And what I think has happened is our ditch has been filled in, stone building has been constructed across it, then because these are big heavy stones, they've kind of sunk a little bit into the soft backfill, which has kind of meant they've been a bit lower. And when you see our buildings on site, you can see they are showing quite a bit of slumping. But that means, because they're at a slightly lower level, when there's been later medieval ploughing, they've been preserved on top of the ditch, and other bits of the walls to the west and the east have been more damaged. So our ditch has actually resulted in some of our stone walls surviving quite nicely. Now what you can see are enough walls for us to be confident there are buildings, but not enough walls for us to be able to draw full walls around any particular structure. Is that a usual kind of frustrating level of detail from an archaeological site? What we can be sure of is that there are multiple wall types with different structural types. So the big wall on the right is made out of mudstone, quite angular mudstone with a rubble core, whereas some of the walls in the centre are made from rounded boulders from the beach. So it must be a series of different structures, and potentially you've got a distinction between external boundary walls and internal features. We've got a series of troughs. We have a beautifully constructed stone gully. We've got work surfaces, and you can see these great big stones, big pink things in the middle. We took those up at the end of the excavation season this year and found underneath them, we found more stone-lined troughs beneath them. So there's clearly phases of structure. Now, interestingly, we find this kind of stone wall elsewhere on Lindisfarne. On the left, you can see, I've scanned in very crudely, some of the drawings by Brian Hope Taylor from his excavations, and you can see he's found very similar walls in his excavations to the west of the parish church. And on the right, you see an early medieval building excavated on the north side of the island at a site called Green Shield. And again, you can see this consistent pattern of big stone walls made out with rubble foundations. Now, these were a surprise because when we started the project, if I'd been asked what kind of building do you think we'd find, I would have said wooden structures, because other early medieval sites which have been excavated like Whithorn or Hartlepool have produced wooden structures. The reason why I don't think we've got them on Lindisfarne, I think it's a lack of trees. It's pretty lacking in trees now. As far as we can tell from the pollen record, there wouldn't have been many large trees on the island back then. So I think what we've got are big, crude rubble stone foundations, probably with turf superstructure, though we can't prove that. But that's my working hypothesis at the moment. So what else have we got apart from structures? Well, the other thing we've got absolutely everywhere are burials. The whole field we're excavating is absolutely chock with early medieval, so 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century burials. This is just one tiny little part of the site, this picture here. And you can see basically every single triangle is marking a burial, and you can see there's the more you look at this, it's like one of those magic eye pictures, the more you look at it, the more human bones you see, the more skulls you see. And what we've got is a lot of intercutting burials there. It's not just that the cemetery spreads across the whole field to the east of the priory, but it's massively intercut, particularly in the centre of a cemetery. So it's a cemetery which must have thousands of burials in there. You can see that some of these burials, the two kind of the one on the right and the one at the bottom. Again, if you look closely, you can see there's too many bones for a single burial in there. And what we've got are later graves cutting through earlier graves and then taking bone from the earlier graves and just sticking them back into the grave cut. But in a number of occasions, some of the bone they cut through and stick back into the grave cut is articulated, which means the bodies they've cut through haven't fully decomposed when they've cut through them. So they are really trying to get, I think they're trying to, because this is quite near where Cuthbert's shrine would have been, I think they're trying to get as close as possible to that shrine. Now the burials themselves are mainly west-east, head to the west, feet to the east. Very few of them have coffins. We've got about 3 probable coffins. And the obvious thing to say is the bone preservation. You can see we've got really good bone preservation there, which is exceptionally rare for the northeast. But the island, the underlying geology of the island is limestone, which means that we've got the soil's not too acid, so the bones survive really well, which is going to be great for us. Now, who are these people? Well, the first thing we can say is they are not the monks. Bede writes quite clearly that there's a cemetery for the monks. But the big cemetery we've got here has men, women, children and babies. And we've got a lot of children and youngsters, as well as men and women. So what we've got looks like the demography of a normal secular settlement or community rather than the monastic community. And that's quite important. Because one of our big questions is who are they? So they're not the monks. So we've got 2 working hypotheses at the moment, or 3 arguably. One is that these people are the islanders, other people who lived on the island and are being buried in a monastery in the early Middle Ages. Or they could be pilgrims and visitors who've come to the island, may have been seeking healing and have died, or may have just wanted to be buried close to Cuthbert. Now, we do have techniques we can start to use to answer some of these questions. We've got the potential to take DNA samples from all our burials because of good preservation. So if everyone's broadly related to each other, there's intermarriage and lots of connections across our buried population, we might expect that to indicate that they are an island community, where if it's more heterogeneous, you might expect there's lots of people from different places coming to be buried. Also, we can look at the chemistry, the bone isotope chemistry of the bones, which starts to tell us a little bit about mobility and where people might be coming from. We've only done a little bit of that so far, but at the moment, the limited number of samples we've got is pointing to the fact that these are probably not all, certainly the people we sampled, are probably not from the island itself. They've probably come in from elsewhere. In terms of the graves themselves, they're not using grave goods by this point. Unless you're St Cuthbert, you get grave goods, but otherwise most people don't. But what we do see, we see some variation. We see some people on their side, most people on their backs, some on their sides, some flat on the front. We've had one crouched person as well. There's other kind of burial rites which might indicate variations. So we've had a small number of coffins. We've had a charcoal burial this year. Somebody buried on a bed of charcoal. We have somebody buried with strakes from a wooden boat placed over the grave. And also we found thousands and thousands of quartz pebbles, which don't come from that part of the island, so must have been brought from elsewhere. And we know from lots of other sites in early medieval Britain that quartz pebbles were regularly placed on graves as markers. And I think what's happened is these quartz pebbles have been placed on the earlier graves, they've then got intercut, and the quartz has ended up just kind of swilling around in that graveyard soil. And crucially, the carbon-14 dates point to a clearly early medieval date for all our burials. Another aspect of our burials are these things. These are name stones. These are small carved stones. They're about that big on the whole. They vary a bit in size. Rounded heads, and see if I can find and it's not terribly clear, but you might be able to see that they all have a central cross, and then there's the name of the person being commemorated written on the cross, sometimes just in Latin script, but quite a few of them use runes and Latin. This kind of little monument is unique to Lindisfarne. There are similar ones with flat heads found down on Teesside, but these are a unique Lindisfarne discovery. Now we've found, and again, I just as I come to this slide, I realise I needed to update it. We've found probably over 20 of these now. They're quite badly fragmented, and you can see a range of the bits and pieces we've got, but you can see we've got names, we've got interlace. We found 3 in the space of about an hour and a half on one day this year. And we're working with John Hines, a professor from Cardiff, on transliterating and translating the names. Inevitably, we've only got the back end of names, or the first bit of names, but we've got at least one Anglo-Saxon name which had never been previously recorded, someone called Utfrith. So these they don't look much, but you need to remember they would have been painted, they would have been multicoloured, and on some of them, the central section is kind of sunk in, so they could have placed a little metal or glass inset. So you can imagine these things painted with interlace, metal fittings on them. They would have looked a bit like a manuscript page. And so you need to think about the kind of dialogue between manuscripts, things like Lindisfarne Gospels, and the stone and sculpture which is being produced on an island like this. We have other bits of sculpture. On the left, you can see part of a small cross-marked stone. Again, it doesn't look much. First of all, I'd say it's in 2 bits. We found the first bit in the first year. We had to wait for another 2 years before we found the second bit. So I got paranoid about checking every single stone on site in case there's something carved onto it. Now, what you've got is a cross with 2 little crosses either side. There are no parallels at anything like that from Yorkshire, County Durham, or Northumberland. But we do have a really nice parallel from the early medieval Northumbrian monastery at Whithorn over in Galloway in southwest Scotland. And they are more or less the same size as well. You can see the Whithorn example on the right. So it shows that the sculpture on Lindisfarne is making connections, reaching out, has parallels in the wider Northumbrian world. We also have traces of what are called high crosses. Now, if you go to the visitor centre today, there are a lot of these bits of standing stone cross, a lot of which have either just always been on the island. No one's been quite clear where they're from. Some have been found in excavations as graves in and around the parish churchyard. Now the bits we found have been quite badly damaged, but you can see here we've got just a corner of something, but actually that is part of a high cross, and by a high cross I mean a stone cross which would have been person height or more. But one of my fantastic former PhD student, Christina Smith, was able to see that and identify that and find some excellent parallels from similar kinds of crosses elsewhere in Northumbria. Then we've had some curiosities like this. This is a namestone-sized stone, clearly being worked and shaped into that shape. If you look very closely, I've accentuated it, there's actually some very light scratchings of a kind of St Andrew's cross with little circles around that. We're not sure what that is. We thought it might be somebody roughing out a namestone, but the cross is on the wrong alignment, and it's not very deep. The stone itself has been carefully worked, but the etching on it is very, very light indeed. We don't have any parallels from this, which is great because it shows that we can find new and unusual things. We're not just finding the same old. We're finding new stuff as we go. So we've got other bits of sculpture. The final kind of thing we have in terms of activity from our site is metalworking. We've had a couple of very badly damaged metalworking areas, mainly cut to pieces by later burials, but we've got evidence for what could be ironsmithing and also evidence for casting of copper alloy objects. We've had lots of spatters in previous years, little spatters and droplets of molten copper alloys. They're clearly casting it. One of our hopes this year is that we might find the moulds from metalworking, and sadly we haven't found that yet. But there's clearly, again on the carbon 14 dates, there's metalworking from the 8th, 9th century AD. I'll skip through that. So we've got a summary sequence. We've got hints of our early, perhaps pre-monastic activity, our bits of Roman pottery, the references to maybe a hill fort potentially, our big north-south ditch, 7th century. Then this is filled in. We've got the construction of our stone features. I would argue what's happening is the monastery is expanding following the Synod of Whitby, the creation of the Cult of Cuthbert, so it's physically expanding, and that's probably the point at which the two churches are laid out on that alignment. Then surrounding the buildings are cemetery. And interestingly, while we have graves which cut building, we don't ever have any buildings cutting graves, so that suggests of, again, a kind of sequence going on there. But it's clear there's a lot of kind of sub-sequences going on, and one of our jobs we need to do is raise money for a lot of carbon-14 dating, because that's the only way we're going to be able to unpick the chronology of what's going on here. In terms of objects to be found, my previous site was a Roman fort, and we had 3 tons of Roman pottery, so I'm quite glad to dig a site with not much stuff, to be honest. What we do have, though, is lovely. On the left, you can see a part of a gaming piece we found. There's a wonderful, so this is a 8th, 9th century gaming piece for a game similar, a lot of you will know the Viking game Nefertafel. That kind of game is not specifically Viking. It's found across the North Sea world in this period. So there's a beautiful parallel from the Pictish hill fort at Dundurn near Perth. You can see in the middle. There's one called, there's another slightly more distant parallel from Gross Stromkendorf in northern Germany, a trading site on the Baltic. These games are played by the secular and ecclesiastical elites in these worlds. These are part of their cultural packages. And we found our one there, and then last year we found a bit of a second one, virtually identical. I mean, we're not even virtually, absolutely identical. We were able to put them next to each other, though the other one was found about 30 metres away, which does suggest there's a whole set of gaming pieces which are being ploughed into the soil. And unfortunately, we haven't found the rest. For me, though, one of the really exciting sets of material we're getting are the faunal remains. Human remains survive really well, but so do the animal bones. So what we've got here are the usual range of animals, cattle, sheep, pig, that kind of things you'd expect. But crucially, we've got an amazing assemblage of maritime and other material. So we're eating geese, not surprisingly, all the migrating geese going to Lindisfarne this time of year. A lot of good eating on those geese, but also we have puffin and seagull and guillemot and great auk, which are now extinct. We found examples of these bones all with cut marks on, so they're clearly being eaten and butchered. Now, the fact they own loads and loads of good farmland, they're probably not eating these because they are desperately hungry. They must be deliberately, preferentially going out and hunting these seagulls. It shows that tastes were very, very different. And certainly things like the great auk and probably the puffin would never have lived on Holy Island itself. They're probably from the Farne Islands. And there were known great auks on the Farne Islands in the 17th century, but as a species, they went extinct in the early 19th century. And there's a little bit of great auk bone you can see in the bottom right down there. We're also getting really good assemblage of fish. We're in a fishing town, so I'm very pleased to say we've got lots and lots of fish. All sorts of things. We've got cod, some quite big cod, all bits of cod. So it's not cod being imported as stockfish. They're clearly fishing from the island, presumably long-lining. We've got monkfish and ling and conger eel and haddock and tope shark. And every year when we get our new report back from our specialists, more fish species emerge. And I think the key take-home point is they are fishing all sorts of different waters. They're fishing the muddy flats, they're fishing the rocky North Shore, they're going out into the North Sea. So they're clearly exploiting those maritime resources quite extensively. We've got a lot of shellfish as well, so lots of oysters. In our ditch particularly, we've got a whole layer of just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of oyster shells. They're clearly eating a lot of shellfish. We've got periwinkles and whelks and limpets. And then finally, we've got seals and whale. So we've got multiple seal bones, more and more butchered seal bone is coming up every year, and every year we get more whale bone as well. So far we've done a little bit of what's called Zoom's work. It's the kind of technique, a mass spectrometry technique, which you can use to identify some animals by species, and we've certainly got Globus ephelini, which are pilot whales. There are other whale bones as well elsewhere from the island. Now, pilot whale, the traditional assumption is that the Anglo-Saxons are not actively whaling, but pilot whales are the ones which are driven to the shore on the Faroes in the Grind, and so it's possible that they are actively driving them onto the shores to hunt them. We don't know yet. And crucially, there's lots of records from the early medieval period of people exploiting whale and seal. So references in the Voyage of Oteré talking about whale hide being used for ropes on ships. We know that things like seal, they're just 8-foot-long bags of angry fat. So there's a huge amount of blubber you can get out and oil you can get out of seals. And again, you can use their hides. The Life of St. Columba, written about Columba, who's the founder of Iona, has a wonderful story which basically say that the monks had proprietorial rights, or thought they had proprietorial rights over local seal colonies. So we can assume that's what's happening on Lindisfarne as well, that the monks see the seals in the surrounding sandbanks and out of the farms as being part of their kind of world. Now sometimes we got curious objects like this. These are salmon bones, salmon vertebrae. The salmon vertebrae naturally have a hole in them anyway, but in these cases our very observant fish bone specialists noticed the holes have been deliberately expanded. And they're found together in a group in a grave. And I think what we've got here are probably prayer beads. And certainly fish vertebrae were used for rosaries in the later medieval period. And there's examples found in archaeological context and examples illustrated in medieval paintings. So I think we've probably got quite an early example of early medieval prayer beads, which is quite nice. We still need to do quite a lot of research on those though. Other things we're getting Anglo-Saxon coins, and again I do need to update this. We've probably got knocking on 40 to 50 Anglo-Saxon coins now of the later 8th and 9th century. And I think this emphasises the role of Lindisfarne as a trading centre. We tend to think of these monasteries, particularly island monasteries, as being remote, distant, isolated places. As I said, Lindisfarne's massively wealthy. It's on major shipping lanes overlooking a Roman road, which is probably used as a main communication route. It's directly indivisible with Bamborough Castle, which is an early medieval power centre, owns all the land you can see. It's hugely wealthy. It's also important to remember that in a world without towns, and in early medieval Northumbria, the only thing you could even debate about being a town would be York. It's places like the monasteries, which are the biggest permanent population centres. Kings are peripatetic, they're moving around all the time, but in terms of permanent population centres, it's the big monasteries like things like Lindisfarne. Beyond that, beyond the coins, we've got other little objects like this little bone comb, which has got, again, a word written on it in runes. I was convinced it was just going to say comb in runes. Actually, it's probably the back end of somebody's name. So someone's literally just written their name on a comb in runes. Possibly Irish influenced. We don't know. So that's a nice set of information. We know that they're eating things and they are building things and they're being buried. How can we start understanding the bigger picture through the archaeology? Well, as I said, there's this traditional idea that the monks, everybody leaves Lindisfarne, the monks take the relics of Cuthbert, and according to Simeon of Durham, they also take a wooden church and a stone cross with them. They move to Norham, and then they move around and ultimately end up in Durham in AD 995. But one of the things we're showing is that with our excavations and with the sculpture, is that actually there's clearly continued activity on the island, in the monastery where we are, in the 9th and particularly the 10th centuries AD. A great example of that is this burial here. It's a bit crude picture. It's this grave here with a stone curb around it. Right at the bottom of that, there was a woman buried in a large wooden chest. We recovered very, very fine gold thread from above her skull. She was probably buried wearing an embroidered braided headdress or similar on her head. So we're happy she's a woman. Her grave is kind of 771 to 987. We're going to be able to refine that date down, I think. Also in her grave were at least 3. I think actually the latest count is 4 other people on top of her and a baby stuck in right at the top. Also, we've got the only other grave we found with a coffin right next to her, this chest burial you can see there. So we've got a really interesting sequence of burials. Now, you could get all that sequence of burials arguably into the chronology, assuming everybody's left. That's a bit of a stone coffin. That's a great big lock plate, so I can skip through that. But we've got a couple of things associated, found at the top of her grave in that curbed area. First of all, we've got a coin of Edward the Confessor. So that's 11th century, but that is before they've come back and reformed the monastery. So that again indicates people are perhaps putting coins or losing coins in or around her grave as late as the 11th century. We've also got this curious object here. This is a fragment of what's called green porphyry, which is a kind of decorative stone. It's marble-like and only comes from quarries in Greece. It's used in an early medieval world. These are used to decorate shrines and for portable altars, little altars which might be kind of used for celebrating services. The bit we found is carefully sawn, clearly got saw marks on one side and very, very polished on the other. Now, this is really interesting object because if you look where else these green porphyry is found in Britain and Ireland, it's found in places like Bornish, Kebester, Brough of Bursay, High Island, St Ninian's Isle, Dublin and Waterford. These are all places which are part of the Hiberno-Norse world, the world of the Irish Vikings. So it looks like this stuff is coming into Britain, probably imported perhaps from Vikings who've been in the Varangian Guard down in Byzantium, bringing it up. But crucially, it's very much part of that 10th century Irish Viking world. So how does this end up in Lindisfarne? Well, we need to kind of recalibrate what we think we know about the Vikings on Lindisfarne. We always tend to think about the Vikings as being aggressors. But by the 10th century, we know from a range of texts that the community of Cuthbert, the corporate body of the monastery of Lindisfarne, and when it moves, becomes incredibly powerful. And it actually is putting Viking kings, they are acting as kingmaker, and they put the Viking king Guthred on the throne of Northumbria. And then we have from the Historia Sancto, from the Libellus de Exordio, a later text, a description of King Guthred, our Viking of 10th century date with Hiberno-Norse connections, giving to that church, i.e. Lindisfarne, the community of Cuthbert, no small quantity of honour and gifts. I think what we've got here is an example of one of those high-status 10th century objects being donated to the monastery in the 10th century and being placed on the grave of a high-status woman. And we could talk about the significance that this grave becomes a kind of focus for later burials, and we've got other burials clustering around that grave, all with 10th century carbon-14 dates. Arguably, I would say, in the long run, Lindisfarne gets more out of the Vikings in terms of gifts and donations of land than Vikings ever nick from their raiding. In the long term, the monastery, the community of Cuthbert keeps on going to the 1530s. The Viking kingdom of Northumbria is gone by the 11th century. So really it's the monks who win in terms of when we think about Vikings versus monks. It's the monks who win quite spectacularly. That's not the only evidence we have for continued activity in the 10th century on Lindisfarne at the point when everybody's meant to have gone. We actually have the sculpture. As I said, there's been quite a lot of sculpture from the island found in past years, found in grave digging more generally. And there's always been a kind of elephant in the room, is that people have always known that actually when you look at the dates of this stuff, most of the sculpture from Lindisfarne, and crucially the best sculpture from Lindisfarne, actually comes from the 10th century. And now, with a little bit of redating going on with sculpture, even more of it is moving from the 9th century into the 10th century. And this is really important because this is high status sculpture, and it has implications. You need someone who can commission that sculpture. You need someone who can design that sculpture, because a lot of it has quite sophisticated theological designs on. You need someone who can literally create that sculpture, and then there's got to be somewhere to put it when you get there. So all this efflorescence of sculpture in the 10th century is more than just, there are some stone crosses. It shows there's an underpinning system and demand for this stuff to be created. And there's that stuff there. This is again a slide created by my student Christina. And then more recently we found a part of another bit of cross on the left there, which again fits into a kind of a class of what are called hammer-headed crosses, which are classic Anglo-Scandinavian style crosses. So again, this is interesting when it comes to thinking about the Vikings. That's a Viking style cross in Lindisfarne. So it shows that those relationships are more complex than people had perhaps previously thought. And finally, when you actually go through the documentary sources, although Simeon of Durham is saying everybody leaves, he's writing much later. He's writing in the 12th century, late 11th, in the 12th century. When you look at contemporary documents, they tell us that actually, there are people continuing to raid. We have records of the site being continued to be raided by Vikings and by the Scots in the 10th century. And they're not just there for the coffee. They are attacking that island because there is something to raid there. And when we have references to the raids on Lindisfarne, Tyningham and Oldham by the Viking Olaf Gufrason in 941, we know that Tyningham and Oldham were ecclesiastical sites, so it makes sense that Lindisfarne must still have been functioning as an ecclesiastical site then as well. We have other things I could talk more about, but I'm conscious of time. But the key thing I'd point out is this reference here. Cuthbert's bones still at Norham, contemporary records from the early 11th century. This directly contradicts the idea that Cuthbert's relics were arrived in Durham by AD 995. In fact, Cuthbert's bones aren't actually recorded in the contemporary records until further into the 11th century. So this kind of also is playing havoc with the other end of the Cuthbert story, the idea that Cuthbert's relics are brought to Durham and that in 995 and their movement to Durham is the foundation legend for Durham, and the traditional story is that it was an overgrown peninsula with nobody there, and then they turn up and they found Durham. Because now, it looks like Cuthbert's relics didn't get there till maybe 1020 or 1030, whilst at the same time, archaeological work being done in Durham by my colleagues in Archaeological Services, Durham University, have done several excavations on or close to the peninsula of Durham, which actually points to early medieval activity, buildings, that kind of thing, as early as the mid-10th century. So whilst the dates for Cuthbert's relics arrival are getting later, the archaeological evidence for activity on the peninsula is getting earlier. So now I would probably say, if someone put a gun to my head, I would say when the relics arrive, they arrive in an established, existing, high-status Northumbrian power centre, which makes much more sense rather than just randomly ending up on an otherwise entirely overgrown hillside. So to kind of finish off very quickly, we can start blocking out the shape of the monastery, I think now. We've got our big enclosure, and this is looking down on the village. We've got, sophisticated computer graphics. I think I deserve a round of applause for that. We've got, first of all, we can imagine our harbour, the water coming up much closer to our headland. So our monastery is really surrounded by water on three sides. We can start to put in boundary ditches. So our boundary ditch is the little one in the middle, though we've now extended that across more or less the whole length of that field. Geophysical survey and things I haven't spoken about today, I can make fairly good arguments that we've also, these two roads shown here, also mark other monastic boundaries within the precinct. We can start thinking about kind of more general early medieval activity. All these yellow spots show where things like early medieval surfaces and occupation layers have been found. And again, you can see right across the whole village. We can start putting in churches. There's a church up on the hoof, which I haven't talked about today because I didn't have time, but which was excavated about 12 years ago. Certainly, I'd say a 10th century church. I would say that the footprints of the later priory church and the parish church they replicate the footprints of earlier Anglo-Saxon churches. There's cemeteries. There's our cemetery, the blue bit to the right of the churches, now covers that whole field. There's burials from the top of the hoof. And last year we excavated a cemetery right at the top of the picture, north of the coach park, for those of you who know. So we're starting to get a sense of the size and complexity of this early medieval site. It's, as I said, these are probably the nearest thing you have to a town north of York during the early medieval period. So there are other things we know out there we haven't discovered. There's references in the Historia Sancta Cuthberto to something called the Green Church, which we have yet to identify. And that is interesting because it's described as being specifically for women, because women were not allowed into the heart of monastic enclosure. So they had their own cemetery, their own church on the edge, and it's described as being called the Green Church as it's out in the greenness of the plain. There's also references to a cemetery and a chapel of St. Columba. Obviously, Columba is the patron saint of Iona, so that reminds us of those connections. I'm wondering now whether this site right up here on the north, this cemetery right on the north, might be that, because just to the north of that is a farm called St. Coomb's Farm. I think St. Coombe, that name must be derived from Columba. So as I said, that's where we are. I've whipped through an awful lot of stuff. There's much more I could have talked about. Somebody today sent me a photograph of a beautiful Anglo-Saxon strap end, which was found metal detecting last week. I only just saw it this morning, so that's nice. We're now just starting the post-excavation phase. There's a lot to do, a lot of work to be done on the skeletons, not just the straight. I mean, the skeletons are amazing. Some of them are very, very ill people. We've got all sorts of horrendous kind of growths and problems with the bones. Some of them have been really badly chopped up, people with multiple blade injuries. Could be Vikings, could be the Scots, could be other Anglo-Saxons, a lot of interpersonal violence back then. Work on the animal bone. I'm interested in doing isotope work on the cattle to see how far they're being grazed and where they're being brought in from. Look at sculpture, looking for micropigment on the sculpture to see whether there's evidence of painting and adhesives. So much to do. So it's going to give me another couple of years so we've got all this written up. So I'll just say watch this space. Thank you very much.